Hey guys, so this is going to be a slightly different video than the normal ones where I'm working through a textbook problem. In this video, I'm going to give 10 tips on how to do well in your physics class. And I think this applies pretty well if you're a freshman, if you're a physics major, anything like that. I think these 10 tips will be pretty beneficial. I also think these tips can be applied to other degrees and other classes outside of physics because I just think they're good study tips in general. So I'm going to go through the 10 tips, starting with number 1. And you might think this one just applies to like freshmen or something like that, but you'd be kind of surprised. So number 1 is to show up to class, actively engage in the class, and make note of any problems done in class. So again, you probably think this applies mostly to freshmen or people that aren't really going to their classes, but even in some of my upper level physics classes, there were several times where students wouldn't show up. And the argument I usually hear against it is that they're not learning much from their professor. And number 1, I would say most of the time, you might not be learning a lot because there are bad professors out there, but you're probably learning something. And even in the case where the professor is really bad and you're learning absolutely nothing from the class, I still think it's beneficial to show up and engage because at the end of the day, assuming your professor is grading your exam or has say over your grade, by showing up, I just feel that you're showing them that you're invested, you're interested, you're trying. And when they're grading an assignment, they might be a little bit more favorable to you if they know that you're really trying. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, it's just kind of human nature. When you have people grading, a lot of times they're going to give beneficial treatment to certain students. And whether it's right or wrong, you want to be on the right end of it. I personally feel that there's been times where professors might have given me an extra couple points on an exam because I was one of the few showing up. So I definitely feel showing up to class, engaging. By engaging, you don't have to be crazy or anything, but maybe ask a question per class, take notes, pay attention, that sort of thing. And note any problems that are done in class. And I'll talk more about this in one of my later tips for the exams. My second tip is, if possible, show up to office hours. And this is kind of similar to one in the sense that you're showing the professor you are trying to do better and you're putting a real effort into it. But there's also benefits to office hours that you don't get in lecture. So you have a chance to have a more one-on-one experience with the professor. You can ask them specific questions that you're not sure about. We'll talk about homework in a little bit. But a lot of times in lecture, at least in my experience, professors don't want to go over a homework question during lecture. They want to answer like a conceptual question. Some professors are okay with it, but I've noticed a lot of them, they don't really want to do that during their lecture that they've kind of scheduled out and planned out. But office hours, it's a lot more acceptable to ask like a homework question or anything like that. And a lot of these tips kind of tie in, so I'll mention them again later on. But if you can show up to office hours, if their office hours are at a time you cannot attend, like another class or work, I found that really if you reach out to the professor, they'll make time somewhere for you. A lot of them will. So even if you can't because of other commitments, try reaching out to your professor. The third one is form a study group with people and work together, study together, do homework together. I don't think, because I've seen some people talk about the size of the study group, I don't think the size of the study group is as important as the people you are studying with. So I've had study groups where there's like 4 or 5 other people and they've been great. And I've had one other person I'm studying with and they've been great. The most important thing, in my opinion, in forming a study group is make sure you're studying with people who are also trying to do their best and working hard. At the same time, they're good people you can bounce ideas off of. You don't really want to work with somebody who is super egotistical and they kind of get in like a competition with you over the right way to solve the problem. You don't want anything like that, but you also don't want someone who's going to be a yes man, or you're the yes man, where you're just kind of following along and like, oh, well, okay. The perfect balance, and it's a bit of a balancing act, is being able to ask questions about the way they did a problem while not having necessarily an ego about it. So in my last semester, I got very lucky. I had one friend who was perfect at that. If I did something on the board and there was a flaw in my logic, he'd call it out, nicely. He wouldn't like call me a name or anything. And, I'd think about it and, oh, yep, you're right. That needs to be fixed. And at the same time, if he did a problem and I mentioned something, and if he realized that, yeah, there was a problem, he'd just be like, oh, yeah, you're right. So that's kind of the perfect type of people you want in your group. So form a study group. Number 4 is what we're on. And I kind of mentioned this in the study group, but justify every step you take when you're solving a problem. So the big mistake that I see, especially with freshmen and some of the earlier students, is they kind of memorize like, oh, well, with this type of problem, it's like this. So for example, if they've done some Newton law problems and they notice that the normal force is always equal to the gravitational force, but then you put a situation where you have like a block pressed against a wall, well, in that case, the normal force isn't equal to the gravitational force. But if you just blindly apply that because that's what you've seen, you'll get it wrong. So even if you have to make notes, I've done that before where I make little side notes explaining, well, this is why I did that. That is my justification. That's something that I think is very beneficial, because then when you're on an exam, you're not reliant on the memory. You're just relying on the thought process. So number 5 says, explain to someone or something how to solve the problems. So this goes great with the study group that I mentioned, is if you have someone in your study group, you guys can take turns explaining it. Just because when you explain it and you say it out loud and you're teaching it to someone else, I've noticed I've retained that information a lot better, whether it's tutoring or in study groups. Even with this YouTube channel, one of the main reasons I started it was because I wanted to basically solve problems while speaking out loud and not looking insane. So that kind of allowed me to do that. I guess you could just talk to yourself and that works. But that's kind of what I did. If you have a friend, or they don't necessarily have to know what's going on. If they do, that's good, because they might be able to ask more pressing questions. But the point is, if you're vocalizing it, you're explaining it, and it starts to show that you have more of a mastery level understanding of that problem solving approach. So it's, I think, a good technique to implement. Number 6, find a balance of seeking help and attempting problems on your own. Another big one with particularly younger students is they see a problem that they don't know how to do, and the first thing they do is look on Chegg or go on Quizlet or whatever it is, put it in ChatGPT. And the problem with that is you're probably not going to have those resources on an exam. And at the college level, your exams are going to have questions that are unique. They're not going to be something you've seen before. It's not something you can rely on memory from necessarily. So you have to be able to You want to get comfortable when you don't know how to solve a problem, but going through the process of solving it. Even if you don't necessarily know where your next step is going to be, just working through it, I think, is a good, great benefit to students. On the flip side, I don't see this very often, but I will mention it. If you're spending an absurd amount of time on a single problem, it might be an indicator that you don't have the prerequisite knowledge to attempt the problem. And it's okay to spend a lot of time on a problem, especially as you go up and take harder classes. There's been a lot of problems I've had to spend 5, 6, 7 hours on before I really got it. But the problems that you're solving should take at most hours. They shouldn't take days. So if you spent 3 days on a single problem and your homework is due tomorrow, well, that's a problem. And from there, you do want to try to get some help, whether that's office hours, asking people, YouTube videos, whatever it is. You have to fill in whatever gap you have, because otherwise you've just hit a wall. It's not, oh, well, I think I'm close. If you're not making any sort of progress, you need to find other resources to help you understand what you need to know to advance through the problem. But again, at the same time, you don't want to get to the point where you're just finding the answers online and copying it down. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Number 7, start studying for an exam 2 weeks before it starts. So I think 2 weeks is a pretty solid time for most exams. And I'll kind of get into the way you can study for exams with some of my next tips. Some exams might take longer, like I'm doing a preliminary exam, and that is more of a months, not weeks, study session. But for most of what you would see, I think just studying 2 weeks ahead, that gives you enough time to understand a lot of the material. So that's what I recommend. Number 8, revisit old homework problems and problems done in class. So the homeworks that you did, do them again. See if you understand them, you remember them. When I mentioned in tip 1 to star problems done in class, do those again. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to see a homework question or a problem done in class on an actual exam. But occasionally it does happen, even in some of my upper level physics courses. Occasionally a professor will kind of throw you a bone and put on a homework question or something like that. So they're worth doing, but they're also worth understanding. So when you get a different problem, maybe along the same difficulty level, you know how to solve it. And you might also say, hey, you said give me 2 weeks to study, but I can maybe redo my homework and do class problems in like 5 days. What do I do with the other week and a half? Well, one thing you can do, and this is something I do, is I do extra problems out of the textbook. And there's 2 ways you can go about it. The first way is, if you are good at it, you can look at problems in the back of the book that look like good exam questions. I don't know how to explain it perfectly yet, but I think I've gotten pretty decent at, okay, this is not a problem that would likely be asked on an exam. This one looks like an exam type question. They're not super easy. They're not ridiculously hard. Maybe they have a couple parts to them. They look kind of like homework, but not exactly. Those are great questions to do because those often do end up on exams. There's a lot of professors who they don't really want to reinvent the wheel. So what they'll do is, if you're an EM, they'll just take some problems out of Griffiths that they didn't assign for homework and throw it on the exam. So definitely do those. If you're not comfortable deciding if a question's a good exam question or not, you can just use a random number generator and work through problems that way. I've done that before too, and it's an effective way to learn more. And then the last tip, number 10, is to utilize all the tools you have. So while not wanting to completely copy your homework or anything, you can use a lot of resources to learn. YouTube is a great one, and that's kind of like what I do. So this channel would be a great resource. So like and subscribe for that. But anything else, any other material that teaches you physics, that's good to use, and you want to use that. So that's 10 tips that I have for you if you're struggling with physics on how you could kind of turn the tide a little bit. Hopefully that helps some of you, and if it did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and maybe I'll post more advice videos like this in the future.